The sun was barely creeping over the horizon when I, Tom Hargrove, stumbled out of my apartment in Willow Creek Estates, a tidy suburban complex just outside Raleigh, North Carolina. My tie was crooked, my coffee mug was half empty, and my briefcase swung wildly as I jogged down the stairs. I was late again for a critical presentation at the engineering firm where I'd worked for 20 years. But when I reached the parking lot, my heart stopped. There, in my reserved parking spot, number 42, sat a gleaming silver SUV, its chrome rims sparkling like it was mocking me. This wasn't just any spot. It was my spot, the one I'd paid an extra $75 a month for, the one I'd defended through 2 years of HOA meetings, neighbor disputes, and endless emails. I froze, staring at the SUV as if it were an alien spaceship. It had a vanity plate that read JOY for all, and a bumper sticker proclaiming, "Live, laugh, love." A lavender-scented air freshener dangled from the rearview mirror, and a stack of reusable grocery bags was neatly arranged on the passenger seat. This wasn't a car, it was a lifestyle statement, one that screamed, "I'm better than you." My blood pressure spiked. I had a make-or-break client meeting in 40 minutes, and now this thing was squatting in my territory. I circled the vehicle, hoping for a note, an apology, anything. Nothing. I checked my phone for the HOA's guest parking log. No record of this SUV. I called the building manager, Carl, but got his voicemail. I texted him. No reply. My morning was already a mess. I'd overslept, spilled coffee on my shirt, and now this SUV was the cherry on top of my disaster Sunday. I didn't have time to play detective. I parked 3 blocks away, sprinted back, and barely made it to my Zoom call, panting and disheveled. My boss, Linda, messaged me mid-pitch, "We'll talk later." That's corporate code for "you're in trouble." By the time the call ended, I was a sweaty mess, my shirt clinging to my back, my Wi-Fi dropping every 5 seconds. I slammed my laptop shut, muttering words that would have made my mother clutch her pearls. I was furious not just at the mystery driver, but at the HOA, which couldn't tow an unauthorized vehicle without a week's worth of paperwork and a notarized affidavit. Spot 42 wasn't just a parking space. It was a symbol of order, of fairness, of my hard-earned place in this world. And someone had violated it. That evening, I camped out in the lobby, sipping lukewarm coffee and watching the lot like a hawk. The SUV didn't budge. By 10 p.m., it was still there, smug as ever. By midnight, nothing. The next day, same story. I left polite notes on the windshield. "Please move your vehicle. This is a reserved space." By morning, the notes were gone, vanished like they'd been swallowed by a black hole. On Wednesday, I noticed a faint smudge where my latest sticky note had been. Whoever this was, they weren't just ignoring me, they were taunting me. By Thursday, I was unraveling. I'd spent 3 days parking blocks away, hauling groceries in the Carolina heat, my arms aching, my patience gone. That's when I saw her. She was striding toward the SUV, her blonde hair pulled into a high ponytail, her yoga pants probably costing more than my car payment. She was on her phone, laughing loudly, her reusable water bottle swinging like a fashion accessory. This was the culprit. I dropped a grocery bag, nearly losing a dozen eggs, and jogged over. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is this your car?" She turned, her smile as polished as her SUV. "Oh, yeah," she said, like she'd forgotten where she parked. "Sorry, I've been meaning to move it." Her tone was casual, like she'd borrowed a pen, not hijacked my paid parking spot for 4 days. I took a deep breath. "This is my reserved spot. I've been leaving notes. I've called the HOA." She blinked, sizing me up like I was the one out of line. "Oh, I thought it was open. It's so close to the building, you know. I figured it was fair game." "Fair game," I repeated, my voice rising. "It's marked reserved, spot 42. My name's on the lease." She shrugged, her smile tightening. "It's just a parking spot, right? No need to get worked up." Then she sauntered off, her phone back to her ear, leaving me standing there, groceries sagging, my jaw on the pavement. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake, my mind spinning with fantasies of petty revenge, towing her car, filling her tailpipe with confetti, painting my spot bright orange with a giant Tom in the middle. But I'm not a hothead. I'm a mechanical engineer. I solve problems with logic, not tantrums. By Friday, the SUV was still there, its live, laugh, love sticker practically winking at me. I called the HOA again. They told me I needed photographic proof of the violation. Proof? I'd been documenting it all week, time-stamped photos, videos, even a clip of her dismissing me like I was a pesky neighbor kid. On Saturday, I caught her doing yoga stretches behind the SUV, in my spot. I nearly choked on my coffee. When I confronted her again, she claimed she'd hurt her ankle and needed the close spot. Before or after your yoga routine? I asked, pointing at her perfectly executed downward dog. She waved me off, limping dramatically, and disappeared into her unit. That evening, something shifted. As I walked past her SUV, I noticed her passenger window was cracked open, and there, on the seat, was a spare key, glinting in the fading light. My pulse quickened. I wasn't going to steal it or damage her car. That's not who I am. But that key sparked an idea, one so perfect it felt like the universe was handing me a script. I wasn't just going to fight back. I was going to build something unforgettable. In my garage, surrounded by tools and blueprints, I sipped burnt coffee and stared at a whiteboard covered in sketches. I wasn't out for destruction. I wanted justice, balance, a way to restore the sanctity of Spot 42. As an engineer, I had the skills to make it happen. I pulled out steel chains, carabiners, and an old industrial winch I'd salvaged from a job site. My plan was simple but bold. Encase her SUV in a web of chains, a non-destructive, fully removable grid that would lock her car in place until she acknowledged her mistake. I spent Saturday night designing a modular system, chains that crisscrossed the vehicle, anchored to a hidden wedge under the tires, secured with a magnetic lock I could control with my phone. It was precise, elegant, and legal. I even wrote a script to log timestamps and footage in case the HOA tried to spin this against me. By Sunday morning, I tested it on my car. It took 15 minutes to install and 5 to remove, leaving no trace. I was ready. That night, under the cover of 2 a.m. darkness, I enlisted my old college buddy, Mike, to help. We moved like a SWAT team, silent and efficient. Mike held the flashlight while I rolled out the chains, looping them around the tires and doors, careful not to scratch the paint. The magnetic locks clicked into place with a satisfying snap. We topped it off with an orange construction net draped across the hood, tied with a laminated tag, reserved for those who respect boundaries. 17 minutes later, we were done. We high-fived in silence and slipped back into the building, my heart pounding with a mix of adrenaline and triumph. The next morning, I was at my window by 6:45, coffee in hand, waiting for the show. At 7:15, she emerged. Let's call her Susan, ponytail bouncing, reusable mug in hand, striding toward her SUV. She stopped dead, her mug nearly slipping from her fingers. She circled the car, tugging at the chains, her voice echoing through the lot. "What is this? Are you kidding me?" It was like watching someone argue with gravity. She called someone, pacing furiously, snapping photos. I sipped my coffee, savoring the moment. By 8 o'clock, the HOA president, George, arrived, clipboard in hand, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Susan unleashed a tirade, pointing at the chains, calling it vandalism. George knocked on my door. "Tom," he said, clearing his throat. "Did you chain someone's car?" I nodded, calm as ever. I did. I showed him my evidence. Photos, videos, emails, the works. I just wanted her to stop parking in my spot. No damage done. Susan appeared in the hallway, fuming. "This is insane," she shouted. "You can't trap my car. You can't steal my spot." I replied, cool as ice. "It costs me $75 a month. You've used it for a week." She demanded that the police be called. They arrived, inspected the setup, and one officer chuckled. "This is the most secure parking job I've ever seen." They ruled it a civil matter and left. I offered to remove the chains if Susan signed an agreement not to park there again. She refused, storming off. I locked the system again and went upstairs, feeling like I'd just won round one. The morning after Susan's SUV became the centerpiece of my chain-link masterpiece, Willow Creek Estates buzzed with a kind of energy I hadn't felt in years. Neighbors lingered by their mailboxes, stealing glances at Spot 42, whispering to each other like they were at a high school reunion, gossiping about the prom queen's downfall. My phone pinged with messages, a thumbs up from the guy in 3B, a laughing emoji from the retired nurse in 1C, even a blurry photo of Susan's chained SUV with the caption, Parking lot performance art, in the neighborhood group chat. I didn't respond. I wasn't here to gloat. I just wanted my spot back. Susan, however, wasn't done. By noon, she was back in the lot, this time with two friends in matching athleisure, circling her car like a pack of pastel wolves. They tugged at the chains, poked at the orange netting, and one even tried Googling how to remove industrial locks on her phone. Susan stood with her arms crossed, glaring at the SUV as if it had betrayed her personally. She spotted me watching from my second-floor window and shouted, "You think this is clever? You're a lunatic." I didn't reply. I just raised my coffee mug in a mock toast and closed the curtains. Let her stew. An hour later, there was a knock at my door. It was Alan, the building's maintenance guy, a quiet man in his late 50s who looked like he'd rather be fishing than dealing with drama. "Tom," he said, shifting uncomfortably. "Susan asked me to cut the chains off her car. The HOA's involved now." I leaned against the doorframe, calm. "Does she have permission to tamper with a private security device on my lease spot?" Alan shook his head. "Didn't think so," I said. "Tell her to take it up with the HOA." He nodded, relieved, and left without another word. By evening, the HOA made their move. An email landed in my inbox with the subject line, "Formal complaint against resident." My stomach tightened, but I wasn't surprised. Susan had gone straight to the top, accusing me of harassment, unlawful restraint of property, and me favorite, creating a hostile community atmosphere. The HOA claimed I'd violated Rule 6.4.3a, unauthorized mechanical modifications on shared premises. They slapped me with a $500 fine and demanded I remove the chains immediately. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because I'd seen this coming. Susan wasn't just fighting for her car, she was fighting for control. I opened my laptop and got to work. Over the next 2 hours, I drafted a response that was surgical in its precision. I attached 6 days' worth of time-stamped photos of her SUV in my spot, screenshots of the ignored notes I'd left, and a video clip of her dismissing me with that smug, "It's just a parking spot" line. I included my unanswered emails to the HOA, a highlighted copy of their bylaws permitting temporary barriers on leased spots, and a detailed explanation of how my chain system caused zero damage. For good measure, I CC'd the regional property manager. I hit send and leaned back, feeling the kind of satisfaction you get when you know you've played your cards right. For 2 days, I heard nothing. Susan didn't approach me, didn't touch her car, just shot me death glares from across the lot. But the neighborhood was shifting. People I barely knew started talking to me. Ruth, a sweet older woman from 2A, brought me homemade banana bread and told me Susan had once reported her for excessive flower pots in the courtyard. A guy named Ed from Building 3 stopped me in the hallway to say Susan had called security on his teenage son for skateboarding too fast. The stories piled up, each one painting a picture of a woman who'd been quietly bullying the complex for years, hiding behind her HOA connections and a fake smile. On the third day, a new player entered the game. I was in the laundry room, folding towels, when an older man named Harold approached. He was in his 70s, wiry, with a voice like gravel. "Tom," he said, glancing around to make sure we were alone, "I know Susan. She lived in my old complex in Durham. I nearly dropped my detergent." Harold explained that Susan had pulled the same stunts there, parking in reserved spots, filing petty complaints, charming the HOA until she got her way. "She was on the board there too," he said. "Got kicked off after 3 families filed a misconduct petition. I've got some old documents if you need them." My jaw hit the floor. This wasn't just about Spot 42 anymore. Susan had a history, a pattern, and patterns matter when you're dealing with someone who plays victim while pulling strings behind the scenes. I thanked Harold and spent the evening building a case that would have made a lawyer proud. I compiled every HOA bylaw, every parking rule, every email they'd ignored. I printed out the community map, circling Spot 42 as my lease space and highlighting Susan's other violations, like the time she hosted an unpermitted yoga retreat in the common area. Then I added Harold's bombshell, scanned copies of notices from her old complex, documenting her reign of petty terror. I drafted a formal letter requesting a public HOA hearing, attaching my evidence and Harold's documents. I sent it by email, certified mail, and dropped a hard copy in the HOA's office box. If Susan wanted to play dirty, I'd play smarter. The HOA scheduled the hearing for Thursday in the community room, a beige box usually reserved for debates about holiday decorations or dog waste policies. This time, it was packed. Word had spread, and residents showed up with their grudges. A couple from 4C whispered about a fine they'd gotten for their kids' chalk drawings. A veteran named Bill muttered about Susan accusing him of faking a disability to get a better spot. The air was thick with tension, and I could feel the tide turning. When I walked into the room, Susan was already there, sitting at the end of the table, her arms crossed, her face a mask of controlled fury. The board members fidgeted with their papers, avoiding eye contact. I set my folder down a thick stack of evidence that could have doubled as a doorstep began. I didn't yell or accuse. I laid out the timeline. The 6 days Susan parked in my spot, the notes she ignored, the emails the HOA ignored, the video of her dismissing me. I showed them the bylaws, the lease, and the proof that spot 42 was mine. Then I dropped Harold's documents, revealing Susan's history of manipulation. The room went silent. Harold stood up, his voice steady, confirming everything. A board member admitted he hadn't seen half my evidence before voting on the fine. A woman from 3B stood up and said, "If Tom's getting fined for this, what about the guy who parks his RV by the fire lane every July?" The crowd chuckled, but the point landed. Susan tried to speak, claiming it was all an overreaction, but her voice cracked. Her usual confidence was gone. The board didn't vote that night. They said they'd review the evidence and decide by the weekend. But I knew I'd struck a nerve. The next morning, I walked past spot 42, still occupied by Susan's chained SUV, the orange net fluttering like a victory flag. My phone buzzed with more neighbor messages. "Keep it up, Tom." And finally, someone stood up to her. I didn't respond, but I felt a quiet pride. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about everyone who'd been pushed around by someone like Susan and told to just deal with it. That afternoon, I got another knock. It was Susan, alone, no friends, no phone, just her, looking like she'd swallowed a lemon. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice tight. "You've made your point. My car's been stuck for days." I leaned against the doorframe. "I want my spot back, and I want you to stop acting like rules don't apply to you." She scoffed, but I pressed on. "Sign a statement that you won't park there again, and I'll unlock it. No drama, just done." She stared at me, her pride wrestling with her need to get her car back. After a long pause, she muttered, "Fine," and left. An hour later, a note slid under my door. It was short, dripping with sarcasm. "I regret parking in your spot. I won't do it again. You win." It wasn't heartfelt, but it was enough. That evening, I went to the lot, unlocked the chains, and removed every piece of my system, wiping the SUV clean. I left a sticky note on the windshield. "Welcome to accountability." By morning, her car was gone not just from my spot, but from the complex entirely. Word was she'd started parking in the visitor lot down the street. The morning after I freed Susan's SUV from its steel cocoon, Willow Creek Estates felt like a different place. The parking lot, usually a mundane grid of sedans and minivans, had become a stage for whispered conversations and knowing glances. Spot 42 sat empty, pristine, almost glowing in the North Carolina sunlight, as if it knew it had won. My neighbors, normally reserved folks who nodded politely and kept to themselves, were suddenly chatty. As I grabbed my mail, Mrs. Carter from 1C stopped me to say, "Tom, you're a hero around here." I chuckled, brushing it off, but the truth was, I felt a quiet satisfaction. I hadn't just reclaimed my parking spot, I'd sparked something bigger. But peace in Willow Creek was like a sunny day in April, nice while it lasted, but a storm was always brewing. By Friday night, a new letter from the HOA slid under my door, stamped urgent in bold red ink. I opened it, expecting a follow-up from the hearing, maybe even a grudging acknowledgement of my victory. Instead, it was a slap in the face. The HOA had reopened their investigation into my unauthorized mechanical locking system and voted to issue a formal violation. The fine? $500, due in 10 business days. No appeal, no negotiation. The letter droned on about community harmony and measured conduct, as if I'd set off fireworks in the courtyard instead of protecting my leased property. I sat at my kitchen table, rereading the letter, my coffee going cold. The board listed 3 names who'd voted for the fine, and there it was, Susan Mitchell. My jaw tightened. She wasn't just a sore loser. She was a strategist. She'd taken her public humiliation at the hearing and spun it into a power play, worming her way back into the HOA's good graces. I could picture her at the board meeting, all fake smiles and crocodile tears, convincing them I was the villain. I called the HOA secretary, Denise, who answered after 20 minutes of elevator jazz that tested my sanity. "The decision's final," she said, her voice dripping with drama, like she was auditioning for a soap opera. I asked how Susan, the literal instigator, could vote on her case. Denise paused, then mumbled something about Susan acting as a neutral board member. I hung up before I said something I'd regret. This wasn't about chains or parking anymore. It was about control, about someone who thrived on bending rules to fit her whims. Susan hadn't gone quiet. She'd gone nuclear. But I wasn't about to let her rewrite the story. I'm an engineer. I deal in facts, not feelings. Over the next 2 days, I turned my apartment into a war room. My dining table was buried under a fortress of papers. HOA bylaws, parking regulations, my lease agreement, every email I'd sent Carl that he'd ignored. I printed out the community map, annotating it with color-coded markers to show spot 42 as mine, alongside other spots Susan had borrowed without permission. I even dug up an old maintenance request where she'd thrown an unpermitted birthday party in the common area, complete with a bounce house that blocked the fire exit. The real game changer came from Harold, the retired HOA president from Susan's old complex. He stopped by with a manila envelope, his hands trembling slightly as he handed it over. "This is everything I kept from Durham," he said. Inside were notices, complaints, and a petition from 3 families who'd gotten Susan ousted from their board for similar stunts, parking violations, petty fines, even accusing a neighbor of excessive noise for playing classical music on a Sunday. It was a goldmine. Susan wasn't just entitled. She was a serial offender, hopping from complex to complex, leaving a trail of chaos. I spent Saturday night crafting a response that was less a letter and more a legal brief. I requested a second hearing, this time with all HOA members present, no backroom deals. I attached my evidence, photos, videos, emails, bylaws, and Harold's documents. I outlined Susan's pattern of behavior, tying her actions here to her history in Durham. I sent it via email, certified mail, and dropped a copy in the HOA's office box for good measure. If Susan wanted a war of procedure, I'd give her one she couldn't win. The hearing was set for Thursday in the community room, a space that smelled faintly of stale coffee and bureaucracy. This time, it wasn't just a handful of board members. The room was packed. Residents I hadn't seen in years showed up, some out of curiosity, others with their axes to grind. Susan sat at the far end of the table, her blonde hair pulled tight, her lips pursed like she was ready to star in a courtroom drama. The board members looked nervous, shuffling their papers, clearly unprepared for the turnout. I walked to the front, my folder in hand, and laid out my case like I was presenting a project to a client. I didn't raise my voice or point fingers. I let the evidence speak. The 6 days Susan parked in my spot, the notes she ignored, the video of her shrugging off my lease. I showed the bylaws that backed my right to secure my spot and highlighted the HOA's failure to act. Then I dropped Harold's documents, detailing Susan's history. The room buzzed. A woman from 4C whispered to her husband. She did the same thing to us with the chalk incident. Bill, the veteran, muttered about her disability parking complaint. The air was electric, like a storm about to break. Harold stood up, his voice steady despite his age. "I saw this exact behavior in Durham," he said. "She wore people down until they gave in. Don't let her do it here." A board member, a nervous guy named Paul, admitted he hadn't seen my full evidence before voting on the fine. A woman from 3B stood up and said, "If Tom's getting punished for standing up for his rights, what's next? Fining me for planting tulips." The crowd murmured in agreement, and Susan's composure cracked. She tried to speak, calling it a misunderstanding, but her words fell flat. The room wasn't hers anymore. The board didn't vote that night. They promised a decision by the weekend, but I could feel the shift. Susan's influence was crumbling, and for the first time, the HOA seemed to realize they couldn't just sweep this under the rug. As I left the room, neighbors patted me on the back, some offering quiet thanks, others just nodding in respect. I didn't say much. I didn't need to. The truth was out. and it was louder than any speech I could have given. The next morning, I walked past spot 42, still empty, still mine. My phone buzzed with more messages, a cookie emoji from Mrs. Carter, a fist bump gif from Ed's son. But the real surprise came at noon. Susan was by the mailboxes, holding a manila envelope, her usual yoga gear replaced with a plain sweater and jeans. She looked deflated. "We need to talk," she said, her voice flat. I braced for a fight, but instead, she handed me the envelope. "It's for your records," she said, then walked away. Inside was a typed letter, short and to the point. "I acknowledge that I used your parking spot without permission. I understand my actions caused frustration and that you responded within your rights. I will not use your space again and agree to follow HOA parking rules." It wasn't warm or apologetic, but it was signed and dated. I folded it carefully and tucked it into my glove box, a small trophy of accountability. That evening, I heard through the grapevine that Susan had resigned from the HOA board. No announcement, no fanfare, just a quiet exit after realizing her power had evaporated. The complex felt lighter, like a weight had been lifted. Spot 42 remained untouched, and for the first time in weeks, I parked there without looking over my shoulder. But I knew this wasn't the end. Change was coming, and it wasn't just about parking. The air in Willow Creek Estates had changed. It wasn't just the crisp North Carolina fall settling in, with leaves piling up in the corners of the parking lot. It was something deeper, like the complex itself had taken a collective deep breath after weeks of tension. Spot 42, my hard-won parking space, stood empty and proud, a silent testament to the battle I'd fought. Neighbors I'd barely spoken to before now greeted me with nods of respect or quick smiles, as if I'd done something bigger than reclaim Susan's claws from my territory. But I wasn't naive. Susan's resignation from the HO board and her begrudging letter didn't mean she'd changed. Entitlement like hers doesn't vanish, it hibernates. I kept my guard up, knowing the quiet was likely temporary. The HOA's decision to rescind my fine came on Saturday morning, delivered via a curt email that felt like it had been written by someone who'd rather be anywhere but behind a desk. After reviewing the submitted materials and testimony, it read, "The HOA board has voted to rescind the violation notice issued to Mr. Tom Hargrove and formally recognize Spot 42 as his designated lease space." It went on to state that unauthorized use of reserved spots would now result in immediate fines or towing, with no exceptions. There was no apology, no mention of Susan's manipulation, but it was a victory clean, official, and in writing. I read it 3 times, not out of disbelief, but to let the weight of it sink in. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every resident who'd been steamrolled by someone like Susan and told to suck it up. The news spread like wildfire. By noon, my phone was buzzing with texts and group chat messages. Mrs. Carter from 1C offered to bake me her famous oatmeal raisin cookies. Ed's teenage son, Jake, sent a meme of a knight slaying a dragon with the caption, "Tom versus Susan, 1-0. Even Mr. Thompson, the grumpy retiree from 1A who rarely spoke, caught me by the mailboxes and muttered, "About damn time someone put her in her place." I smiled but kept my responses short. I didn't want to be a hero or a spectacle. I just wanted my spot and some fairness in this corner of suburbia. But the ripple effects of a hearing were bigger than I'd expected. That Sunday, I noticed more residents lingering in the common areas, swapping stories about Susan's past transgressions. The couple from 4C, the ones fined for their kids' chalk drawings, started a petition for clearer HOA guidelines on minor violations. Bill, the veteran, told me over coffee that he was drafting a proposal for better accessibility in the parking lot, tired of the HOA's lip service to disabled residents. My little stunt with the chains had cracked open a dam, and years of frustration were spilling out. Willow Creek was waking up, and it felt like the start of something real. Susan, meanwhile, was nowhere to be seen. Her silver SUV hadn't returned to the main lot, and word was she'd been parking in the visitor spaces down the street, a good 5-minute walk from the building. I caught a glimpse of her once, grabbing her mail in a plain hoodie, no Bluetooth headset, no yoga swagger. She didn't look at me, but her eyes had a flicker of something resentment, maybe, or the kind of quiet calculation that made my engineer's brain take note. I didn't trust her silence. People like Susan don't just fade away. They regroup. On Monday, the HOA announced an emergency meeting, not about me, but about overhauling their parking policies and complaint procedures. My case had lit a fire under them, and residents were showing up with their grievances. The meeting was set for Wednesday evening in the community room, and I decided to attend, not to gloat, but to make sure the momentum didn't fizzle out. I brought my folder just in case and arrived early to find the room already half full. People were talking openly now, sharing stories of ignored maintenance requests, unfair fines, and Susan's reign as the HOA's unofficial enforcer. It was like the complex had been holding its breath for years, and my chains had finally let it exhale. When the meeting started, the board looked rattled. George, the president, tried to keep things orderly, but the room was alive with questions. Why had it taken so long to address parking violations? Why were board members like Susan allowed to vote on their disputes? A woman named Linda from 2B stood up and asked why the HOA hadn't acted on her complaint about a leaking roof for 6 months. The energy was electric, and for once, it wasn't just about Spot 42. It was about accountability, about a community tired of being bullied by bureaucracy and one woman's ego. I didn't speak much, but when George mentioned revising the parking rules, I raised my hand. Whatever you change, I said, keeping my voice even, make sure it's enforced equally. No exceptions, no favorites. The room nodded in agreement, and I sat down, feeling the weight of their support. Susan wasn't there, which didn't surprise me. She'd resigned, but I suspected she was still pulling strings behind the scenes, maybe through a loyal board member or two. I made a mental note to keep my evidence folder handy. By the end of the meeting, the board promised to draft new policies, faster response times for complaints, a clear process for reporting violations, and most surprisingly term limits for board members. That last one got a round of applause. It wasn't a revolution, but it was a start. As I walked back to my apartment, I passed Spot 42, still empty, still mine. I smiled, not because I'd won, but because the complex felt like it belonged to all of us again. The next morning, I decided to add a small touch to my victory. I'd been thinking about it since the hearing, a way to mark Spot 42 without being petty or permanent. I went to a local hardware store and bought a simple wooden plaque, then spent the afternoon in my garage carving the words, "Reserved. Respect required." I sealed it with weatherproof varnish and installed it at the edge of the spot, just visible enough to make a point. It wasn't flashy, but it was clear. Neighbors noticed immediately. Mrs. Carter chuckled when she saw it, and Jake, Ed's son, snapped a photo and posted it to the group chat with the caption, "Spot 42, untouchable." For a few days, things were calm. I parked in my spot, went to work, and started to believe Willow Creek might change. But on Friday, as I was unloading groceries, I saw Susan again. She was standing by the visitor lot, her SUV parked haphazardly across 2 spaces. She wasn't on her phone or strutting like before. She just watched me, her expression unreadable. I nodded politely and kept walking, but my gut told me this wasn't over. Susan didn't strike me as someone who let go of grudges easily. That evening, I got a call from Harold. "Tom, you need to know something," he said, his voice low. "I heard from a friend on the board that Susan's been talking to a lawyer. Something about emotional distress and public humiliation." I laughed, but it was a hollow sound. Emotional distress? She'd parked in my spot for a week, ignored my notes, and manipulated the HOA into finding me. If anyone was distressed, it was me. But I thanked Harold and spent the night double-checking my files. Every photo, every email, every timestamp was backed up on my laptop and an external drive. If Susan wanted to escalate, I'd be ready. The next day, I installed a small security camera overlooking Spot 42. It wasn't about paranoia, it was about insurance. I'd learned that fairness doesn't stick unless you protect it. The camera was discreet, tucked into a corner of the building, but it sent a message. I wasn't playing anymore. I also printed out Susan's letter and taped it to the inside of my glove box, a reminder that accountability, once earned, was worth defending. By Sunday, the neighborhood was still buzzing. The HOA's new policies were being drafted, and residents were forming a committee to oversee their implementation. I wasn't on IT, didn't have the time or the patience for meetings, but I promised to support them with evidence if needed. Spot 42 had become more than a parking space. It was a symbol, a line in the sand that said, "This is where we stand up." And as I parked there that evening, the plaque gleaming under the streetlights, I felt a quiet pride. Not in the chains, not in the fight, but in the fact that one small act had sparked a change bigger than me. The days following the HOA's emergency meeting felt like the calm after a storm in Willow Creek Estates. The North Carolina air carried a hint of autumn, crisp and clean, and Spot 42 remained untouched, its wooden plaque reserved. Respect required, standing as a quiet sentinel. My mornings were peaceful again. I parked my car without a second thought, sipped my coffee without rage, and went about my life as a mechanical engineer, designing solutions for problems far less personal than a stolen parking space. But I wasn't foolish enough to think the saga with Susan was over. People like her don't vanish quietly, they slink into the shadows, waiting for a chance to strike back. I kept my evidence folder close and my new security camera rolling, just in case. The neighborhood, though, was different. Residents who'd once kept their heads down now spoke up. The couple from 4C, emboldened by the HOA's new policies, successfully pushed for their chalk drawing fine to be refunded. Bill, the veteran, got approval for a designated accessible parking spot closer to his building. Even Mrs. Carter started a small gardening club, reclaiming the courtyard from Susan's old complaints about excessive flower pots. Willow Creek was starting to feel like a community again, not just a collection of apartments ruled by bureaucracy and one woman's ego. My role in it all was fading into the background, which suited me fine. I wasn't here to be a hero. I just wanted what was mine. But Susan hadn't disappeared. On a chilly Tuesday morning, as I headed to my car, I saw her SUV back in the visitor lot, parked neatly this time, no longer sprawling across two spaces. She was by the mailboxes, sorting through a stack of letters, her usual yoga gear replaced with a plain coat. She glanced at me, her eyes narrowing, but didn't say a word. I nodded politely and kept walking, the weight of her signed letter in my glove box giving me a quiet confidence. She'd lost her HOA power, her influence, and her parking privileges, but I knew better than to underestimate her. That afternoon, Harold called again. "Tom, you're not going to believe this," he said, his gravelly voice tinged with amusement. "Susan's been talking to folks in the visitor lot, trying to rally support. Says you humiliated her, and she's thinking of suing for emotional distress." I rolled my eyes. Emotional distress? She'd hijacked my spot for a week, ignored my notes, and tried to find me through her HOA cronies. If anyone had a distress case, it was me. "Thanks for the heads up," I said. "Let me know if you hear more." I hung up and checked my camera footage. Nothing suspicious yet, but I backed up the files anyway. Engineers don't take chances. By Wednesday, the HOA's new policies were posted on the community board. Immediate towing for unauthorized parking, a 48-hour response time for complaints, and term limits for board members, effective next election. The notice didn't mention Susan or me, but it didn't need to. Everyone knew what had sparked the change. Neighbors started calling it the chain wrap incident, a nickname that made me chuckle. Some exaggerated the story, claiming I'd used military-grade steel or that Susan had called the FBI. But most got the heart of it right. One guy, fed up with being ignored, had stood his ground in a way no one could forget. On Thursday, I got an unexpected visitor. It was Linda, my boss from the engineering firm, who lived in a nearby complex and had heard about the saga through a mutual friend. She stopped by with a bottle of wine and a grin. "Tom, you're a legend," she said, laughing. "Chaining a car? That's next-level problem-solving." I invited her in, and we talked over glasses of Merlot. She wasn't just there to Joe, she wanted my input on a new project, a nod to my skills that felt like a professional olive branch after my shaky Zoom presentation weeks earlier. As we chatted, I realized the parking fight had done more than reclaim Spot 42. It had reminded me of my strength, on and off the job. Friday brought another surprise. As I was leaving for work, a new neighbor, a woman in her 30s named Emily, was unloading boxes near the entrance. She looked frazzled, juggling a lamp and a stack of books, clearly unsure where to park her moving truck. I offered to help, carrying a few boxes and pointing her to the visitor lot. "Is it always this quiet here?" she asked, wiping sweat from her brow. I smiled. "It wasn't, but it's getting better." She glanced at Spot 42's plaque and said, "Nice sign. Someone must care about that spot." I laughed. "You could say that. It's been through a lot." That evening, the HOA sent a final email, closing the book on my case. They confirmed that Spot 42 was mine, no fines would be issued, and they were implementing a new system for residents to report violations anonymously. It was a small but significant win, proof that the system could work if you pushed hard enough. I printed the email and added it to my folder, a keepsake of a battle well fought. Susan, meanwhile, had gone quiet again. Her SUV stayed in the visitor lot, and she avoided the common areas. Neighbors reported seeing her at the grocery store or jogging on the far side of the complex, always alone, her Bluetooth headset nowhere in sight. Some said she was planning to move, tired of the whispers and side-eyes. Others thought she was just lying low, waiting for the next opportunity to stir trouble. I didn't care either way. She'd signed her letter, lost her board seat, and stopped parking in my spot. That was enough. A week later, I hosted a small barbecue in the courtyard, inviting a few neighbors who'd supported me. Mrs. Carter brought her cookies, Harold shared stories from his old HOA days, and Bill toasted to fairness and parking spots. It wasn't a victory party, just a chance to reconnect with people I'd lived near for years but barely knew. As we ate burgers and laughed about the chain wrap incident, I realized Spot 42 had become more than a piece of pavement. It was a symbol of standing up, of saying no to unfairness and meaning it. Months passed, and the story faded into Willow Creek lore. New residents moved in, oblivious to the saga, and the HOA's new policies took root. Complaints were handled faster, board meetings were more transparent, and the community felt alive in a way it hadn't before. I kept my camera on Spot 42, not out of fear, but as a reminder that some lines are worth defending. The plaque stayed, too, its carved letters weathering the seasons but never losing their meaning. One spring morning, as I parked in Spot 42, Emily, the new neighbor, waved me over. She was planting flowers in the courtyard, part of Mrs. Carter's gardening club. "I heard the full story about your parking spot," she said, grinning. "You're kind of a legend." I shrugged, a little embarrassed. "Just a guy who wanted his spot back." She pointed at the plaque. "That's more than a spot, Tom. It's a statement." I nodded, realizing she was right. Spot 42 wasn't just mine, Anna Marie. It belonged to everyone who'd ever been pushed around and decided to push back. As I walked to my apartment, I felt a sense of closure. Susan was still around, a quiet figure on the edges of the complex, but her power was gone. The HOA was changing, the community was stronger, and Spot 42 stood as a quiet reminder that fairness isn't given, it's earned. I'd drawn a line, wrapped it in steel, and made it stick. And in doing so, I'd helped Willow Creek remember that respect isn't optional. What did you think of Tom's battle for Spot 42? Was his chain-wrapping stunt a brilliant stand against injustice? Or did he go too far? How would you handle someone like Susan in your own life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's talk about standing up to bullies, navigating unfair systems, and where you draw the line between justice and revenge. Your perspective matters, so don't hold back.